This is the Visible Voices podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Resa Lewiss. In today's episode, I speak with the Glaucomfleckens. Now, I know you're saying to yourself, how did Resa secure such coveted guests? Well, it was hard. It took months. It took my people talking to their people, and eventually the people met, we talked, and the rest is history. So I'm so glad to bring you my conversation with Will and Kristen Flannery. Let me tell you a little bit about each of these two. And if you haven't checked out their podcast, Knock Knock Hi, or their platform, which includes YouTube, TikToks, and now some upcoming live shows, you should. Will and Kristen promote humanity and a healthy sense of humor in healthcare. Do you hear those H's? Humanity, healthy, humor, healthcare. As means of background, Will Flannery is an ophthalmologist and part-time comedian. He moonlights in his free time as Dr. Glaucomflecken, a social media personality who creates medically themed comedy shorts for an audience of over 4 million across many social media channels. Kristen Flannery holds a bachelor's degree from Texas Tech and a master's degree from Dartmouth College. Go green. It's not easy being green. Known internationally as Lady Glaucomflecken on social media, she offers a very unique perspective on healthcare. She, as I say, speaks medicalese. She's experienced being a patient, a caregiver, and a co-survivor of her husband's 2 cancer occurrences and sudden cardiac arrest. So when we get to the conversation, audience, we're going to do a deep dive into their experiences together as a couple medically, about coming out of traumatic experiences and healing, and about what it's like how to be a guest on a podcast. I'm a big fan of alliteration. And on your website, when you talk about your work and your platform, it says that you seek to promote humanity and a healthy sense of humor in healthcare. A lot of H's right there. Humanity, healthy, humor, healthcare. Will's like, where is she going with this?
Yeah. I did.
Where did that alliteration come from? It's good. But I think for listeners that aren't familiar with you two yet, podcast, platform, YouTube, etc., it's a really good summary of your mission for your work. Promote humanity and a healthy sense of humor in healthcare. I want to kind of get into the medical diagnoses and what I'm going to say the trauma. So that's a little bit of a warning. And I'm going to read from your website again and to give listeners a little bit of background on the two of you. And my question that I'd like you two to keep in mind is, how is it when you hear this over and over and over again? Does it hit you differently each time? By age 35, Will had suffered 2 cancer occurrences and a sudden cardiac arrest. Kristen took on the unexpected roles of caregiver and, quote, co-survivor of these traumatic experiences. In May 2020, Kristen woke up in the middle of the night to Will dying in their bed, while their 8 and 5-year-old children were asleep in the next room. She called 911 and performed 10 minutes of CPR before help arrived. As a coping mechanism, she turned her story into advocacy for survivors and co-survivors of medical trauma and critical illness. For her efforts, this is amazing, Kristen received an EMS Cardiac Arrest Save Challenge coin 2020, the Citizen CPR Foundation's 40 Under 40 Award in 2021, and the American Heart Association's Resuscitation Champion Award 2022. So, who knew that we were with such an award winner?
Right? No kidding.
All right, so Kristen, you take it first, then Will. How does it feel to hear this paragraph again and again and again, and to revisit this in your episodes when you meet another podcaster?
It's kind of desensitized to it. Obviously, we know the story, but hearing it in that way, it's a little more sanitized, right? It's just the facts as they happen. So it feels different to me than, revisiting the actual memories. So it's kind of, in a different category in my mind and my emotions, right? This is my advocacy piece. And that is very therapeutic, to be able to talk about all of this. And I think language is also very important in processing and healing. And so writing about it, speaking about it, having guests on the podcast and chatting about it, all of that is just my therapy, kind of. It helps me, process, but also feel like, we didn't just leave these bad things that happened in our lives as horrible memories and then move on, right? We took control of them in a way, right? And turned them into good things for the world. And that makes it something that's easier to swallow and easier to live with. That's not to say it erases any of the trauma or the memories or anything like that, but it does, it turns it from something that's out of your control into something that you feel like you're taking some control back and almost like sticking it to it, right? By like making things better than what happened to you.
Trauma.
Yeah, exactly.
What about you, Will?
I agree. A little bit desensitized. We've talked about it so many times. And when it really hits me when we talk about it in front of a live audience, because I'm always surprised that, like, maybe it's like my social media ego speaking. Like, I just assume everyone knows about my story. Like, sure, I mean, I'm everywhere on social media. Of course, the whole world knows about this already. But then we go and speak to medical groups and sometimes non-medical groups as well. And then the looks on people's faces when they hear about the cardiac arrest, the tears, the standing ovations that really Kristin gets.
Award winning.
Exactly. It's a reminder to me, like, this isn't normal. This isn't like just a thing that happened on a random Thursday. Like, this is an extremely meaningful thing, because it's easy to lose sight of that the more you talk about it, right? That it kind of starts to feel just like, oh, a thing that happened a few years back. But it's a profound event in our lives, and seeing other people's reaction to it reminds me of that.
Yeah. I really have enjoyed on my podcast episodes when I have guests, they're usually doctors, not always, when we talk about this concept of cumulative trauma over time. And sometimes it's by working in the emergency department, sometimes it's being a trauma surgeon, being exposed to gun violence. Sometimes it's like events at home or diagnoses, such as what you two have experienced. And one of the most poignant, I wanted to use that word right there, poignant conversations I had was with author Minda Harts. And she talked about trauma in the workplace. And she was a C-suite type. So it wasn't, in the hospital. And in her book, she really laid out ways to heal and ways to address the trauma. And, we've talked about a few so far: humor, talking about it, writing about it. I'm wondering if each of you could come up with one other behavior, one other activity that you've done that has really helped you.
That's a good question. I mean, we touched on it a bit ago, but the one that comes to my mind immediately is the advocacy. Turning it into change in the world. I think that really, for me in particular, I don't know that. I mean, everybody's different. I don't know if that would really resonate with you, Will, but for me, that's been very helpful.
Yeah, I do. I'd say probably most of the advocacy work I've done is surrounding the cancer and like young adults with cancer. Yeah, I've done a lot in that way, raising money for organizations and things, and that does help me. But also, like, I don't know, I'm just in my own head a lot. I have trouble finding other outlets to kind of process, and so for me, like, the comedy is like 99% of how I cope. And also Kristin, there's a lot that like people don't see, and I wouldn't be alive without her, but I'd also just be in rougher shape emotionally and mentally, because she's always there to put things in perspective for me, to tell me when I'm acting a certain way, and she knows whenever I'm struggling with something, right? Because we know each other so well. And so she kind of calls me out on that stuff when I'm maybe a little bit too inside my own head and need to get out of that cycle. And so, I think my thing would be you, Kristin.
Look at that. Well, and that was not even planted.
Yeah.
But this is part of why I really enjoy our conversations, and I'll make it sound like we actually meet on a regular basis at the coffee shop to have conversations. But no, I've said to you, like, Will, you speak legal, not legal. Well, actually, you do speak legal. You speak insurance and legal now, but you speak medical. And Kristin speaks quite fluent medical. And so you're actually a really good duo. This thing works. And to that end, let's kind of come out of the deep and come a little lighter. Your platform, the TikToks, the jokes, the podcasts, the speaking engagement. Do you have an ultimate goal of where you'd like to go with this?
Not at all.
we're winging it.
It really has been, though. I mean, because I've got this other medical career, right? And that's been the focus for so long. And so the social media thing started as just a hobby.
Right.
And in a lot of ways, I still think of it as a hobby, but it's less so now, especially over the past year or year and a half, when we have like a legit business and we've got all these projects and an employee and a production team. And so now we've kind of been forced to, I mean, Kristin's always so futuristic thinking. I am very much not futuristic thinking. I'm like, what's right in front of my face? But now I've had to like change the way I think a little bit and start thinking more forward. And so there are, some projects that we want to eventually do. We got these live shows and stuff, and we've got some grand plans. But in terms of, in 15 years, I want to be this and doing this. And I don't think I don't have that. Do you have that in your head?
Not in that way, but I do have, some goals for what I hope all of this silliness eventually accomplishes, right? Like,
right.
I have a side of it, it's kind of like a darkness and a lightness to our entire story and certainly our brand. And, Will gets the privilege of being the lightness most of the time. And then I explore more of the darkness in my work. And then sometimes we come together and we both are doing a little bit of comedy. But my kind of overarching goal for the whole thing that I do, my part of it at least, is I want people to be aware of the fact that all of these things, that happen to patients of critical illness and in medical trauma, right? Like those happen to the people around them as well, like their family members. So it's this concept of co-survivorship that's really the thing that the engine, that keeps driving me to do this work is to bring more awareness to that issue, and not just awareness, but, policies and procedures and actual change to make life better for them, including doctors. Doctors are kind of co-survivors, right? The vicarious trauma that you all witness. I mean, it's a little bit of a different meaning than what I usually mean when I say that, but it includes, healthcare workers and patients and their families, and just trying to make it, as we say, more human for everyone.
And I would really like to explore the origins of the cardiology-nephrology conflict. Like we both have different goals and different things. It's like maybe some goals are better than others and more meaningful, but they're still goals nonetheless.
Yeah, is that kind of like the cornea specialist and the retinal specialist?
Oh yeah, front of the eye, back of the eye. There's big conflict there.
That's what I'm saying. It's all about the canal of
Montagues and Capulets,
I'm Dr. Resa Lewiss, dropping in to tell you about a book that Dr. Adair Landry and I wrote. It's called Microskills, Small Actions, Big Impact. It's a business self-help book being published in April of 2024 by HarperCollins. We believe every future goal, complicated task, and healthy habit can be broken down into simple, measurable, and tiny skills that you can practice and then excel by removing obstacles, overcoming assumptions, and maximizing your potential at work and in life. You can pre-order it now. Go to bookshop.org, amazon.com, or wherever you buy your books. Alongside what you just shared, Kristin, when I joined your episode, and I really appreciate that you were willing to have me come on. We talked, we did a bit of a deep dive in ultrasound and human-centered design. Having the patient, the caretaker, the doctor, whoever's going to be the end user at the table talking. And I think the two of you are best suited to be healthcare designers. And so I'd like each of you to take something that you would love to fix, build, change, create, devise, invent to make patient care, patient workflows, caretaker, trauma, anything better. Now, there's a no repeat rule here. So Kristin, we've talked about, I love yours, the night of the cardiac arrest, you didn't know what was happening as they were resuscitating Will, and they told you to wait in radiology where your mobile phone did not work. So that healthcare design challenge, question, obstacle. We can't repeat that one. So can you come up with something healthcare design, a project that if you had to work on something, this is what you would like to fix, design, brainstorm, iterate on?
The first one that came to my mind is in the world of ophthalmology. And I would love for there to be a fundoscopic camera in every single emergency department in the world. That would be amazing. And like have some kind of, everybody just knows how to use it, and it's easy, and it's functional, and it's cheap. And I mean, selfishly, that would make my life easier. And maybe it'd make your life easier too.
Yeah.
Right.
So when we think about human-centered design, we approach with curiosity and we ask questions. How might we, I'm curious if. So how might we make that a reality? How can we make that happen?
Money.
It's always the problem.
I think, well, I think part of it's also ophthalmology as a field. We're just way too insulated. We're like in our own world. And that's been just progressively over decades. We've just been removing ourselves from the rest of medicine to the point where like nobody outside of ophthalmology knows anything about the eyeball, nor do they really care so much. Like, not that you're not interested. It's just that you got so many other things to do. And then, nobody tries teaching ophthalmology. Nobody, so it's just the outside of my own field, it's not a focus at all. And so I think that would have to change.
All right, Kristen, what are you going to redesign? How are you going to make the world better?
I would like to see our healthcare spaces be more patient and family centered. I think I don't think other smarter people before me have said this, that, healthcare is designed around disease and not people. And so I would really like to see it be designed around disease and people.
Was there any specific disease that came to mind?
Well, for me, he's the one that thinks about disease. I think about the people.
Conjunctivitis.
But you've shared
cataract.
And you shared your experience with chronic illness and hypermobility. And
yeah.
Are there ways or experiences where you're like, wow, that could have been so much better if, or I'm curious if we might?
Yeah, I think that I have a lot of thoughts. Something like hypermobility, I think would benefit from more education and awareness about it, for one thing, but also interconnectedness, right? Healthcare is so siloed. And that's, I think, one of the major downsides of this model that we have, where everyone specializes and subspecializes. And that has its benefits, but it also comes with, this major con of it's really hard for doctors in one area to be able to communicate well with doctors in another area. I know we have EMRs and theoretically that should help, but it doesn't. It doesn't quite do the job. So, I think sometimes something like hypermobility, you need an Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, you need a pattern of things, right? You need to be able to see a more complex picture than just one subspecialty would be looking into. And it's not going well right now for people with diseases like that are more complex. Or even in his case, he just has so many different things between the two cancers and the cardiac arrest. He's got all sorts of specialists, right? But they are not necessarily communicating with each other all that much. So that would be one thing. And then just the spaces themselves. And I know this probably seems like a luxury or a first world problem. But I do think it makes a big difference in just people's morale when they're dealing with something so difficult, whatever has brought them to the hospital. If there are comfortable sensory experiences around them, right? Nice, soft, supportive chairs, maybe some blank, I don't know. I'd have to think about like specific things in the hospital. But like, I remember when I went in for his cardiac arrest, it was the most bizarre thing because obviously his health and what just happened is the main concern. But the experience of that trauma and being in shock like that, it also had this really major sensory component, So something like a weighted blanket or a heated blanket or something like that.
There you go.
I know that sounds odd, but that really would have helped because you just feel like a raw nerve, and anything you can have. And I think if you look in palliative care, you'll find, some people talking about this more and some evidence for it, but it's a very sensory experience and things that can ground you, this feeling of being grounded back down to the earth, I think really helps and is soothing. And then if you're able to be at least a little bit soothed, then maybe you can think better, communicate better, make the decisions better that you're needing to make in those moments. Things like that of just making the sensory experience of being in the hospital more human-centered.
We have blanket warmers everywhere in hospitals.
I love blanket warmers.
That's
They're
where
the
the interns live.
They're the best.
Yeah. Just get yourself a warm blanket. We could swaddle you.
I would have loved to be swaddled in that moment. Yeah.
There's no reason you can't swaddle an adult.
Quick story. One of my friends is an ICU doc, and she had an older patient that was just really, really uncomfortable, not sleeping, maybe moaning and screaming on a regular basis. And they just could not calm this patient. And ultimately, my friend gave the patient, placed in the ears, earplugs. And all of a sudden, the patient calmed. The patient fell right to sleep and slept a whole night and was much more coherent and improved the next morning. So simple things about a little bit of sensory deprivation and creating calm and de-stressing.
Yeah, I think understanding our nervous systems a little better and applying that knowledge to what's the experience in the hospital like would really benefit patients and families. Yeah.
I'm going to move us to more fun stuff because I know you, again,
this is all fun.
Like, wow, this Resa, whoa. Like, we're serious over here. Everything's very serious. So I want to know, listeners want to know, you've now had plenty of guests on the show, and you don't have to name names, or if you want to, you are welcome to name names. What are some of the characteristics of the best podcast guests? And what are some of the most challenging characteristics of guests when you're like, oh my gosh, that was the longest, most tiresome episode we recorded?
I think that energy is always good in any kind of media. And this is something that like I struggle with sometimes too. Like sometimes I'm recording, I feel myself because I'm not a naturally like super bubbly, like excitable person.
No.
Right?
He's much like edgier and cynical and quiet. My natural like tendency is to be kind of like gruff and I don't know, low key and not say much. Like you have to say a lot of words in a podcast.
Sometimes talking is hard. So it's I've had to try to like teach myself or like focus on like keeping my energy up because that's important because nobody wants to listen to like a NPR. For like an entertainment podcast.
I take issue with that. I enjoy NPR.
Well, no, you know what I mean. But like that kind of like soft,
monotone.
It's not what we are going for on our
It's not what we're going for. And so for our guests, obviously it helps to have more energy. So I think that's if you're going on a podcast and you're not sure if what you have to say is interesting, if you're excited about it, that's like 90% of it, honestly. Yep. Because then other people are going to be excited listening to you be excited about the thing. I think that's so key because honestly, what I've learned in doing all the social media stuff is people love hearing people talk about things they're experts in. Mm-hmm. It could be the most boring thing in the world, but if you are an expert in that thing and you have excitement and people sense that excitement, they're going to listen to what you have to say. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the challenging ones are, we've had really great guests, so it's not easy to find a memory of one. But if there are technical issues or the person is not as familiar with how to troubleshoot when something happens, that can definitely be a bit of a challenge. And then kind of on the flip side of if they're not excited or if they just aren't very talkative about it, like trying to pull them out if it's kind of one word answers, that makes for a difficult experience on a podcast.
And that's part of what our job is as hosts, right?
Mhm.
Like we got to try to create an environment where people feel comfortable, showing who they are and showing the fun side of their personality, because we all have one.
Yeah.
And so, it's not just all on the guest, it's also
Right.
on us.
I mean, that part probably mostly on us.
For sure.
If you're a good interviewer, then, it's going to be hard work. It's going to be a challenge, but it's part of your job.
For the people that have been on our podcast, none of you are duds.
No.
All right. Well, maybe one or two of you.
Oh,
but mostly not duds.
Mostly. And do you prefer to be a guest or you prefer to be the host?
It's more stressful to be the host, I think.
Yeah, more work.
It's more work, but I mean, it's still fun, but it is more work to prepare for an interview. I feel like coming on something like this as a guest, like I can just,
Sure.
I don't know, there's no stress. I can just talk about whatever the hell I want.
Yeah.
With your guidance, of course.
Of course.
Resa.
I'm creating a safe vessel, psychological safety. We talked about that before too.
That's right.
The podcast is called The Visible Voices. And I think I've perhaps shared this with you. People that have not had the experience of being made invisible or marginalized in some way will say, Resa, you can't see a voice. Why are you saying visible voices? You don't see a voice. I'm like, I'm very well aware that we don't see voices. However, walk with me along this journey. Together, we're going to amplify voices and help people be seen and heard. Walk with me.
It's a metaphor.
And so my common question for my guests, and now's the time. Kristen, you can take it first, then Will. When did you realize you had a voice? And when did you start using that voice?
Well, I think my parents would say immediately, just from birth. Honestly, I have never considered that I didn't. Like, it's never occurred to me not to use my voice.
Good.
I don't know. I'm just that's just part of how I'm wired, I think. But, I can't take any credit for it or anything, but I have strong opinions, and I certainly don't share all of them, but when I have one that I feel like is worth sharing, I have a lot of conviction about that. And, I'm not afraid to get it out there. I don't know. I've been a performer. It's just kind of who I am. I'm not shy about being the center of attention, as long as I feel like I kind of know what I'm talking about in that arena. But I don't know. I wish I had a better answer of how people can discover their voice.
I'm going to push a little further on that and ask you, is there a time you recall that maybe your voice got quieted, either by a person or by a situation? Like maybe when you were in grad school and trying to figure out your graduate work, or...
Yeah, that's a whole can of worms. Grad school.
Man, she really has listened to our podcast. She's pulling this stuff out. She's never even met us or been to our home.
Yeah, really. No, grad school. My particular experience in grad school, the department that I was in at that time, it was a very toxic culture, and so, you certainly had to be very careful about how you went about things, and things had to be very political, and you had to, it was exhausting, having to do that, and you had to sacrifice some things if you weren't willing to play that particular game. That was tricky. Honestly, the time I have felt the most silenced was in my experience at the hospital after his cardiac arrest.
Mm-hmm.
Through his whole health journey, I have felt rather invisible because he's the patient, and because he is the patient, he rightly so gets a lot of attention, and we absolutely should pay attention to patients, and they are the acute priority in that situation. It's just that tends to stop there when it should continue on to paying attention to the people who are, if you're in the room with someone receiving healthcare like that, you probably are very intimately connected to that person in some way, where your lives are very intertwined. Otherwise, why would you be there?
Mm-hmm.
And so just to continue on to the people that are there with the patient as well. So, in those cases where it was like people didn't necessarily look at me while they were giving the information. They would just look at him. You didn't ask me if I had any questions, things like that. I think we've talked before, or certainly on our podcast, we've talked before about there was only one ICU nurse through the whole thing, both cancers and cardiac arrest. Only one person from the healthcare system ever asked me how I was doing. And when he did, it was so shocking that it like kind of took me, a second to reply. I kind of was taken aback. So I think, honestly, the healthcare system is the thing that of everything in my life has made me feel the most silenced, which I think is why I'm now so vocal about it. It's kind of in, response to that.
Co-survivor and secondary trauma. All right, Will.
Yeah.
When did you realize you had a voice, and when did you start using that voice?
I think when I learned I had a voice was when I made some TikToks about a health insurance company, requiring prior authorizations for cataract surgery. And it was this big deal in the field of ophthalmology. And then I got a message about people in the C-suite at the health insurance company being angry and wanting my video removed from the internet, which is not how the internet works. That was like a whoa moment for me. Like, okay, people are really paying attention to what I have to say. And like, I can do some things here. At the very least, just making health insurance companies angry is like, that's great. I love that. But yeah, that was recently, right? I mean, I had, maybe a million or so followers on social media, and I still didn't really feel like I had an important voice. I feel like people, relied on me to make them laugh at the end of a hard day. But I guess that's a helpful voice, but in my mind, maybe this is just the like imposter syndrome, medical, trauma, doctor way of thinking, like, diminishing, ourselves a little bit. But I didn't feel like I had an important voice really until that people started paying attention to some of the health insurance advocacy stuff I was doing.
Yeah. Well, Will and Kristen Flannery, you certainly have visible voices individually and together. For listeners who are wondering where they can find out more and listen to you and follow your upcoming shows and other activities, where can you send them?
Got a nice website, Glaucomfleckens.com. Spell it like it sounds. It's easy. And we're on all the social media networks, so you can always find us wherever you like to consume your social media. But everything's on our website in a easily.
You can find our podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts.
Knock Knock Hi
with the Glaucomfleckens. Yep.
The Resa wrap up. Special thanks to Kristen and Will Flannery for joining me in conversation. 3 take-home points for you, audience. Number 1, laughter. First of all, if you need to rewatch Mary Poppins so you understand the song I Love to Laugh, to which I'm referring, please do so. The science shows that laughter is good for us. It's good for well-being, it's good for your health, and it's good for healing. Next, advocacy. There are many ways to wear, to do, to act advocacy. And what I really like about Kristen and Will is the way they've decided to do their advocacy through comedy, through talking, through speaking medicalese. And finally, visibility and invisibility. I really appreciate Kristen's story about what it's been like being a caretaker, being a co-survivor with Will's cancer, the reoccurrence, and his cardiac arrest. It's pretty remarkable that with all those experiences, she was only asked how she's doing once. That's all I have for you this week, audience. See you next time. The Visible Voices podcast amplifies voices both known and unknown, discussing topics of healthcare, equity, and current trends. We are a production of the People's Media Network. Our team includes Dr. Giuliano DePortu and me, Dr. Resa Lewiss. Please find me on social media at Resa Lewiss and through the website, thevisiblevoicespodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please rate and review us. Share the podcast with a friend today. Thank you so much for listening. And as always, to be continued.